Okay, continuing on from our last lecture that's looking at the psychoanalytical theory or Freudian theory. Yesterday we went over the assignment you did on defense mechanisms. And I know that was some tough psychological theory. I feel like everyone did a really good job. You attempted to connect Freudian theory to real life examples and personal examples to make them meaningful. And I hope that helped you understand some of the real life application of Freudian theory. So to just kind of finish the rest of his theory today, we are just going to continue. So last lecture we talked about big ideas, unconscious mind, the idea of the iceberg model of personality, that behaviors are manifestations or symptoms of what's going inside the mind. And we talked about kind of the id, the ego, the superego, and how we use defense mechanisms as a way of protecting our ego and avoiding having to deal with kind of those unpleasant realities of what sometimes go on in our lives and might be actually at the bottom of our iceberg and influencing our behavior. Okay, so to continue on, Freud, like I said in my last lecture, he's very well known in pop culture, and a lot of the theory he created is just part of psych terminology. And a perfect example of that is something called the Freudian slip. And it's been nicknamed the Freudian slip. Its proper name is slip of the tongue. But basically the idea of a Freudian slip, and it's used a lot on TV, is that sometimes people misspeak and they say something through their speech that they don't need to say. And Freud would say that this is very significant and that these are clues. When we misspeak or say something that we don't mean to say, these are clues of our unconscious mind trying to get out through our consciousness. So it's this idea that, again, that bottom of the iceberg, all of the things in our unconscious mind are constantly trying to surface in our consciousness, but we suppress them through defense mechanisms. But he believed if you're aware enough and you're looking for them, you can find these little clues. And one of those things he talked about was the Freudian slip. So when you misspeak, he would argue you're actually saying what's on your mind, your unconscious mind, and it's its way coming out in the form of speech. There's a lot of really funny ones. Obviously, that would be used so well in comedy. So I put a few clips in and a few little images that talks about Freudian slips, but they're used a lot in TV and in pop culture. The other big part of Freudian theory was this idea of dream analysis. And when we do the unit on sleep and we talk about dream theory, one of the ones we'll study is Freudian theory. And he thought dreams were a window into your unconscious mind. And so he believed strongly in analyzing and interpreting your dreams, and that could help you understand what was really bothering you, what was at the bottom of your iceberg. So dream interpretation is rooted in the psychoanalytical theory. When we do dream theory, we know that some people believe dreams are nothing, and some people believe they're very, very meaningful. Freud believed they were meaningful. He thought when you sleep, you were in kind of the in-between between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, so that middle part of the iceberg, the preconscious level. And he said that when you were in your preconscious level, all the stuff from the bottom of your iceberg, the unconscious, would come to that level. And then when you woke up, if you interpreted or analyzed those dreams, they would be symbolic representations of what was happening in your unconscious mind. So Freud talked a lot about the interpretation of dreams and the need to analyze the symbols that reoccur in your dreams. He suggested that if our unconscious mind showed itself in true form in our dreams, we would become, too anxious, or it would be too bothersome and we'd wake up. So he suggested that our motives would disguise themselves in symbolic representations or symbols in our dreams. And that by analyzing those symbols, it would give us a clue to what was happening in our unconscious. So he encouraged all of his patients to keep like a dream diary where he would look at reoccurring symbols or reoccurring themes, and he would attach meaning to it. So you can actually look, there are such things as dream dictionaries, you can buy them, you can look at them online, and people who believe in dream theory will often write dream dictionaries, so psychologists will. And if you go through, it's just like a dictionary, starts with like A, so, apple, And if you dream of an apple, it will tell you what they think it means symbolically. Or if you dream of a ladder, or if you dream of falling a lot. So some people hold a lot of value and truth in this. Some people think it's nonsense. It depends where you're going to fall on dream theory. Freud was highly motivated by the idea that a lot of our urges that drive us are sexual. And so if you look at a true Freudian dream dictionary, a lot of the symbols are what we call phallic symbols, so symbols for male and female parts, or that have a sexual kind of connotation to them. And it almost becomes a joke because, you know, everything, according to Freud, dreams is some kind of sexual symbol. Later psychologists, again, adapt this, and they don't think every symbol is a sexual or phallic symbol. So if you look at a modern dream dictionary, it might provide some insight into what's going on, or it might not, depending on what you think about dream analysis. But to a psychoanalytical perspective, dreams were very important. They were those windows into our unconscious mind. I often don't dream. I rarely dream. But I have had in my life one reoccurring dream, and it's very bizarre. So I started getting this dream when I was in high school, and I've had it throughout my life at different times. Sometimes it will go 5 years and I won't have it, but it's the only reoccurring dream I have, and it's always the same. So I'll tell it to you. It's so bizarre. It changes, like when I was living at home, I would wake up and I'd be in my bedroom at home. When I moved out on my own, it was my new bedroom. But I always wake up and my bedroom's totally white. Everything's white, there's no other color. And I get up and I go into my ensuite, or if I was back at home, I went into my bathroom, and it was my bathroom, but everything is also white. And it's just me and the mirror, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror. And then I start to wiggle my front tooth, and I wiggle it, wiggle it, wiggle it, and it's very loose, and then it falls out. And then I go into my next tooth and I wiggle it, and then it falls out. And I'm always very, distressed that my teeth are falling out. But I essentially wiggle all of my teeth out. So, it's a weird dream. And I don't know what my feelings about dreams are. But it was my only reoccurring dream. So finally I thought, you know what, I'm gonna look at a dream dictionary, because it's a symbol that keeps reappearing in my dreams consistently. It's the only one. And I thought, like, it's gonna be so weird. I don't wanna know what this means. But when I looked it up, and I looked at a whole bunch of different dream dictionaries written by different people, and essentially loose teeth, or your teeth falling out, are just a sign of stress. So it's not actually, sometimes symbols aren't what you think they might mean. And when I reflected on that, every time I had the dream, I was kind of going through like a transition period, or a change, and change can be stressful. So for me, it kind of made sense, but I don't know if it was just, the suggestiveness of it as well. But something you might want to look at sometime if you're just interested in dream theory is a dream dictionary rooted in Freudian theory. Okay, he also suggested, Freud strongly suggested that what happens to you in your childhood and your childhood experiences are going to shape and have a profound effect on you as an adult. It will determine how your personality develops and how you develop. So he said childhood experiences are very important, and particularly traumatic childhood experiences are very important to be aware of, and to bring out those ideas, bring them from the bottom of your iceberg to deal with them, because he suggested traumatic childhood experiences is the root of a lot of current unhealthy behavior. So a lot of psychologists believe and argue that what happens to you as a kid, whether it's good or bad, it's hard to shake as an adult. It's hard to break those patterns of behavior. It's hard to change the way you see yourself once you've learned to see yourself a certain way as a child. So lots of psychologists take this idea that what happens to you as a child is extremely important in your development, and something that often has to be looked at in therapy. So Freud often talked about, your childhood kind of shaping how you develop as a young adult. So that was another kind of Freudian idea. Freud became super popular and very controversial in his one theory, and he stood by this even though a lot of other psychologists attacked him. But he gained like great fame and controversy by suggesting that most people are driven by sexual urges. But what made him really controversial was that he suggested even children. And I don't think the world was ready for that idea, and I don't know if we still are ready for that idea. This became very, very popular, this theory, Whether psychologists believe it or not, it's still well known. It's called the Oedipal complex. So when you hear people say, well, she has daddy issues, that's rooted in Freudian psychology. So the Oedipal complex was named after a Greek myth. But basically the concept of it is that little boys, and I'm gonna laugh because it's just like, it's so weird, but little boys are secretly, according to Freud, attracted to their mothers. And they're jealous of their fathers. And it's named after this Greek myth where that's what happens. And so little boys are secretly attracted to their mothers and they're jealous of their fathers. But as they grow up, they realize that it's inappropriate to have those kind of feelings towards that mother figure. And so in order to get a woman like their mother, they start to identify and become like their fathers. So when they hit like adolescence, they'll become like their fathers in order to subconsciously attract a woman that's like their mother. And so there is some theory that comes out of psychoanalysis that says that, you know, we're attracted to people that remind us of our parents, whether it's personality-wise. They did one study where they found that men were attracted to women more if they shared like a similar feature or bone structure of their mothers. Some people term that sexual imprinting. Again, it depends what theory you're following. There's a reverse complex that he talked about called the Electra complex. It's just reversed for girls. So this idea when girls are little, they're secretly attracted to their fathers and jealous of their mothers. And so they often fight with their mothers when they're young. And then as they get older, they start to identify and become like their mothers so they can hopefully attract a man like their father. So do with that theory what you will. But it caused a lot, it rocked the boat for sure, to suggest that little kids have sexual urges towards parents, really kind of bizarre stuff. The term penis envy, I don't know if you've ever heard it. Freud has a lot of sexual theory. Penis envy is this idea that as women, we are envious of men because we don't have penises. I don't know. I'm okay with that one. But it's really part of pop culture. This whole term penis envy was rooted in his theory. So you do see Freud, whether you want to or not, in a lot of psych talk. Okay, he also developed, and this movement is known for psychotherapy, which nowadays is nicknamed talk therapy. And this is widely used by most psychologists. But it's this idea, if you've ever seen in movies when like the guy's lying or the woman's lying on a couch and the psychologist is sitting in a chair behind her and kind of writing down everything she's saying, that's traditional psychoanalytical therapy, psychotherapy. So the client would come in and talk and talk and talk, and the psychologist would kind of document everything they say and start looking for connections between what they say and recognizing patterns of behavior with the goal of making the client aware of their thinking and their behavioral patterns and drawing attention to kind of those unconscious motives that they might not be aware of, but that an outsider might see and notice. And the whole goal again is to make a person aware of what's really motivating their behavior. Freud used this idea of this term called free associations. And it's really interesting, and usually when we're in class we do an example, but basically it's this idea that Freud again believes that your unconscious mind is trying to get out all the time. So he would give you a list of words, and the idea when you do a free association is you don't think, you don't hesitate, you say the first thing that comes to your mind. So if I say cat, you might say dog. If I say house, you might say chimney, right? And the point is you don't pause. You say the very first thing as fast as you can. You clear your mind and you just blurt out what comes to your mind. And you do it over and over again very quickly. So cat, dog, clock, chair, rabbit, and the other person then would list whatever comes to their mind. And Freud thought eventually you would slip up and something significant would come out of your mouth. He would also throw in what he would call trigger words. So he'd get you going with normal words, shoe, tomato, and then he might say your mother's name. And he'd see what you blurted out, or he'd give a whole bunch, tree, dog, fire hydrant, and then he might say your boyfriend's name. And without being prepared for that and without pausing to think, what do you say when you hear your boyfriend's name? Or what do you say when he says your best friend's name? Or if you have a phobia, something like swimming, what do you say when he says water? And he would look for kind of those secret messages from your unconscious mind coming out. So it's really fun. We usually do them in pairs just for fun. So you can do them with a friend, and you can throw in like a trigger word if you want to throw in like something from their past, or like, you know, someone that you know that's a mutual friend, to see what they say. It's an interesting concept of not limiting your speech and not thinking about it before you actually let out what comes to your mind when you think about that term or that person. So like I said, there's a ton of examples of this in pop culture. So in your video, in your PowerPoint, I included some. Freudian slip is something he's really well known for. If you Google Freudian slips on TV, there's always like compilations of them. This is just a cartoon. It says, obviously that's Sigmund Freud sitting in the chair, and it says, a Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but mean your mother. I mean another. So that's supposed to be funny because it explains Freudian slip, and because Freud believed that, you know, people have so many issues with their mothers and fathers. So that's just part of that kind of joke. There's this one too, it's called the Freudian slip and slide. Again, because Freud constantly talked about, you know, these repressed sexual motives. The man, that's Freud, and he's on a slip and slide, and he says, I'm having the best time ever, instead of the best time ever, because there's an attractive girl standing beside him. So that's an example of a Freudian slip. I included 3 pop culture references. So the first one in your PowerPoint is a clip from Friends, and I know a lot of you watch Friends because I read your All About Me sheets. But this was like one of the season finales, and obviously most of you know Friends. Ross and Rachel, they were on again, off again, and then at one point Ross is about to marry Emily, and obviously he still loves Rachel and Rachel loves him, and she shows up last minute at the wedding, and of course if you're a Friends fan you know this scene, but when he goes to get married to Emily he says Rachel's name, right? And Freud would say that's significant. So it was a really big season finale cliffhanger. Oh, Ross said Rachel instead of Emily. But again, this concept is a Freudian slip and is used in pop culture. If we go to the next one, this is probably the most famous use of a Freudian slip in a comedy, which is the Austin Powers movie where the character played by Fred Savage is a mole, and he also has a big mole on his face. And all the way through the movie, it's a running joke not to talk about his mole. But of course, Austin Powers has the mole on his mind, and he can't not think about it. And so constantly when he's speaking, he's making Freudian slips because the mole on his face is on his mind. It's really funny. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it. The next one I included is also from Friends. Obviously, I watch Friends a lot. But it's an example of free association. So in this episode, it's a little like compilation of little scenes throughout the whole episode, but characters use the free association to find out like where they really want to go on a trip or what they really think about something. So it's a perfect pop culture example of Freudian's free association. So you can watch that too. This is all just like real life connections where you can see his theory and see how it's like used in real life. Okay, last little bit. So again, this is your typical psychotherapy or talk therapy where one person's on the couch and the psychologist is behind them. You see it in movies a lot. So obviously, again, the goal of treatment, according to Freud, was to make a person aware of their unconscious mind and to bring all those unconscious motives to a conscious level so then you could deal with them and your behavior would become more healthy, which is really the goal of most therapy, is to find out our behavioral patterns, our thinking patterns, have someone else maybe point out what we're not aware of that's motivating us and help us get that clarification and that perspective, and then once we're aware of it, to deal with it, okay? So again, he said only once the true source of distress was brought to a conscious level could a person deal with it and then start to get better and correct whatever unhealthy behavior was plaguing their lives. Interesting thing about Freud too is he was a big, he was big on hypnosis, and we'll talk a little bit of hypnosis as a type of therapy. So I know when I say hypnosis, you picture like the thing in front of your eyes, follow the watch back and forth, and when I count to 3 and snap my fingers, you're gonna cluck like a chicken and run around. So that's the kind of hypnosis you see on TV. This is a different type of hypnosis, and there are psychologists that are trained in hypnosis. But basically the idea is when you're in a hypnotic state, you're kind of in between, very similar to a dream state, between your conscious and your unconscious. You're kind of in a pre-conscious state. And Freud thought by using hypnosis, you could transfer those unconscious motives to a pre-conscious level, and then even once you're in that pre-conscious level and you're seeing what's kind of going on, you then, when you wake up out of the state, can talk about it and deal with those ideas. Hypnosis is widely criticized as a therapy technique, and lots of psychologists say it's unethical because when you're in a hypnotic state, you are extremely suggestible, which is why some people, when they're hypnotized, will do things that they wouldn't normally do. Some people use hypnosis to try to quit smoking. So when they're in a hypnotic state, they'll get messages about how harmful cigarettes are, you don't like cigarettes. So some people think it's very beneficial and it works. Other psychologists are extremely critical of it and say, in fact, it can be unethical because you can implant false ideas into a person's mind, and that a psychologist shouldn't have that kind of unchecked power. Either way, Freud used it as, again, a means to get in between or connect that unconscious mind with the conscious mind. Okay? So this is just a little psych humor. The dog's lying on the couch. They're doing some psychotherapy, and he says, I have a confession to make. I don't come here to be psychoanalyzed. I come here because you let me lie on the couch. Funny. Just showing you where you see kind of psychology in everyday pop culture. Okay, the last thing that I included in your PowerPoint for today is that final video I talked about a bit in our last lecture, where it's called History versus Freud. So they look at some of his main theories, and I don't know if you've ever watched these little clips, History versus whoever. It's when they take someone important in history and they're in court and they argue about, whether he was a good figure in history or bad. In this case, they're talking about whether Freudian theory holds true today or if it's outdated and unreliable, whether it was ever really valid. So you have two sides, one that's supporting Freud and his influence in psychology, one that's kind of debunking him. Either way, Freud is a huge figure in psychology and laid the groundwork for a lot of theory. So whether he was off in his theory or whether some of it's just plain old bizarre, it's still there, and it still created a dialogue and kind of, paved a way for the way we think about the unconscious mind and our inner selves. So that's it for today. You'll see I also attached part 2 of the assignments, one for each theory that we're looking at. So the conditioning list of 12 ways you've been conditioned was part 1 that went with behaviorism. Part 2 I attached, which goes with Freudian or psychoanalytical, and what it's asking you, and you'll see it on your sheet, it's asking you to take Freud's idea that what happens to you when you're a child is significant and shapes who you are, and to try to connect it to a real life example from your life. Right, so it says Freud and the psychodynamic perspective argue that our childhood experiences have a major influence on our personality development. So what it's asking you to do is to select one example of a childhood experience or something from your childhood and connect it to some aspect of who you are today and your current identity. So this takes a bit of thinking and a bit of self-reflection. How did something that happened to you in the past, whether it was good or bad, it doesn't have to all be bad, how did it shape who you are right now? How can you see that connection? So I've had students talk about like a personality trait, like, being really shy. And, for example, they were really outgoing when they were little, and then they had to transfer schools and they had trouble making friends. And it was a little bit traumatic for them, and now they see aspects of being shy around people as a young adult, and they think it's tied to that transition in their life when they had to switch schools and meet new people. Or it might be reverse. It might be that you spent a lot of time with your grandma when you were young, and she was such a role model to you, and you can see aspects of her personality in you now. So you got these really good traits from having the experience of a childhood being around her. Sometimes it's linked to a phobia, like you might say, I have a huge fear of water because when I was 7, I was swimming in the lake and I almost drowned, or like I felt something brush my foot and it freaked me out, and now I don't like going in water. So something as a child impacted some aspect of who you are today. So everyone's is going to be different. It doesn't have to be this big traumatic event from your childhood. It can be a good thing. But most people have something that happened to them in their past that they feel kind of shaped who they are today. So link it to some type of aspect of your personality, some type of trait, a like or dislike, and see if you can find this kind of Freudian connection between something in your childhood and some aspect of who you are today. So that's your assignment for today. That's it for Freud. If you go on to university and keep going through it, you'll be introduced to this guy a lot again later in your psychology careers. But that's Freud in a nutshell. Thanks, bye.